It is the 21st of August, 1796. Archduke Charles, one of Austria's leading military commanders, is on the march with nearly 30,000 men near Theiningen, Bavaria. His aim is to destroy a detachment of the French army of Sambre and Meuse and prevent its advance towards Vienna. Over the next 2 days, the Battle of Theiningen is fought, in which the outnumbered French inflict significant casualties on their foes before staging a fighting withdrawal towards the River Rhine. The man responsible for this action is one of a new generation of French commanders who, thanks to the revolution and the sweeping away of the old aristocratic officer class, have risen through the ranks due to their talent alone. Over his career, the man will go from the rank of private to a Marshal of France under Napoleon and ultimately a king, laying the foundations of one of Europe's last major royal dynasties that still rules Sweden today. His name? Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, the common soldier who became a king. The man known to history as Marshal Bernadotte, later King Carl XIV Johan of Sweden, was born as Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte on the 26th of January 1763 in the town of Pau, in the Gascony region of southwestern France. His father, Jean-Henri Bernadotte, was a lawyer who served as a royal prosecutor in the city, while his mother, Jeanne de Saint-Jean, was a farmer's daughter from a respectable family living in the neighbouring town of Bouy. Jean-Baptiste was the youngest of 5 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. Jean-Baptiste himself had been born prematurely and was not expected to survive his first few days, though he pulled through. As a child, Jean-Baptiste would have grown up with stories and legends surrounding Pau's most famous son, Henry of Navarre, who became King Henry IV of France in 1589 after agreeing to convert to Catholicism towards the end of the French Wars of Religion. Henry IV was the first member of the House of Bourbon to become King of France, and at the time of Bernadotte's birth, Henry's descendant, Louis XV, was on the French throne. The king's predecessor and great-grandfather, Louis XIV, the Sun King, had been the paragon of absolutist monarchy in early modern Europe, moving his court to the Palace of Versailles outside Paris, expanding his eastern frontiers into the Low Countries, and establishing France as the centre of European culture by employing artists and architects from all over the continent. While Louis XV matched the grandeur of his great-grandfather's court, his military record was less impressive, and during the middle of the 18th century, Britain defeated France in the 7 Years' War and obtained French Canada in the peace negotiations. The war had only ended in February 1763, a month after Bernadotte's birth. Louis XV died in 1774 and was succeeded by his grandson, Louis XVI, who invested heavily in the French Navy in an attempt to reverse the humiliations of the 7 Years' War. Versailles and Paris were far away for the young Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte in Pau when he was growing up. He probably studied at the local Benedictine school. Like his elder brother, Jean Evangeliste, it was intended that Jean-Baptiste would follow in his father's footsteps into the legal profession. Thus, he was apprenticed to a family friend who worked in the law at the age of 14. However, in the spring of 1780, Henri Bernadotte died unexpectedly at the age of 69, leaving the family badly indebted. While his elder brother was already a practicing lawyer, the 17-year-old Jean-Baptiste still had several years of his apprenticeship left. Fearing that he would be overshadowed by Jean Evangeliste if he continued as a lawyer, and without a clear financial means to continue his training anyway, in September, Jean-Baptiste abandoned his legal apprenticeship and joined the Régiment Royal la Marine, the colonel of which, the Marquis de Laon, may have been acquainted with the Bernadotte family. After completing his basic military training at Collioure near Perpignan, Bernadotte joined the regiment at Bastia on the island of Corsica, which had only been acquired by France from the Italian city-state of Genoa in 1768. Although the French had forced Corsican independence leader Pasquale Paoli into exile, the new provincial government on the island continued to be disturbed by bandits in the mountains. Bernadotte's regiment was responsible for maintaining order here and protecting French property. Following Paoli's defeat, his secretary, Carlo Bonaparte, switched allegiance to the French authorities, enabling him to send his sons Joseph and Napoleon to study in France. While he was not personally acquainted with the Bonaparte family, Bernadotte's service in Corsica and his awareness of Corsican politics, including a basic knowledge of who the Bonapartes were, would give him an advantage when Napoleon swiftly rose up the ranks of the French military and political hierarchy in the 1790s. In May 1782, Bernadotte transferred from the Fusiliers to the elite Grenadier Company, but he soon fell ill and returned to Pau, where he stayed for a year and a half after extending his leave. By the time Bernadotte returned to the ranks in 1784, his regiment was stationed in Besançon in eastern France. In November, it transferred to the garrison at Grenoble. During Bernadotte's absence, the young Marquis d'Ambert had been appointed commander of the regiment in January 1784. Bernadotte enjoyed d'Ambert's favour and was rapidly promoted to the rank of corporal in June 1785 and then sergeant in September. The tall 22-year-old Bernadotte cut a fine figure and soon acquired the nickname Sergeant Beaujon, or Sergeant Finelegs. Bernadotte's time in Grenoble was marked by increasing political instability across France. King Louis XVI's spending on the French Navy and earlier aid to the American revolutionaries, who had established their independence from Britain, had cost the French exchequer a huge amount of money. The fiscal crisis continued to get worse and worse in the 1780s, compounded by poor harvests that brought borderline famine conditions to much of France. When the regional court in Grenoble resisted Louis's attempts to centralize power, the Régiment Royal la Marine was ordered to escort the dissenters into exile. Bernadotte, by now a sergeant major, was at the scene on the 7th of June 1788 when troops fired on civilian demonstrators, killing 2. The events at Grenoble undermined the authority of King Louis, who was forced to call a meeting of the Estates General, the feudal body that represented the clergy, aristocracy, and the commoners of France, and the closest thing France had to a national parliament. It had not convened in France in 175 years. When it met in 1789, the hundreds of members soon took over the government of France and launched the French Revolution to try and completely reshape French society, much of their activity being aimed at destroying the old nobility and the privileges of the Church. The resulting anarchy would see many young men in the military, like Bernadotte and his near contemporary Napoleon Bonaparte, rise to positions of immense importance. In late 1789, the merchants of the southern port city of Marseille requested military protection from the government as the revolutionary unrest spread around France. One of these men was the silk merchant François Clary, whose daughter, Désirée, later claimed that D'Ambert had offered to billet Bernadotte at the Clary house. In early 1790, Bernadotte was promoted to adjutant major on D'Ambert's staff, but the hot-headed colonel was soon involved in an altercation with the local National Guard unit and was sent into exile. This did little to calm the situation, and soon the regiment was ordered to leave Marseille. A new colonel was appointed in June, and by July the regiment was near Rochefort on the Atlantic coast. As the revolution in Paris became increasingly radical under the influence of the left-wing Jacobin Club, the regiments of the Royal Army were renamed in early 1791, and the Royal La Marine became the 60th Regiment of Infantry. As part of reforms to democratize the army, the rank and file could nominate candidates for promotion. Although Bernadotte was expected to win a commission, he was overlooked by the officers of the 60th, and he was, instead, appointed lieutenant of the 36th Infantry Regiment in late March. The radicalization of the revolution during this period caused concern among the European monarchies about the treatment of King Louis XVI and his wife, the Austrian-born Queen Marie Antoinette. The Queen's brother, Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, threatened to intervene with military force if the French royal family came to any harm. While Leopold died unexpectedly in March 1792 and was succeeded by his son Francis, France preemptively declared war on Austria in April. The campaign began poorly as an imperial army under the Duke of Brunswick advanced into eastern France. In July, Bernadotte headed to the front as the 36th Infantry joined General Adam Philippe Custín's Army of the Rhine in Alsace. On the 10th of August, a Parisian mob stormed the Tuileries Palace and slaughtered King Louis's Swiss guards, and the king lost his remaining constitutional powers. As Brunswick marched on Paris, his momentum was unexpectedly halted by Generals Kellermann and Dumouriez at Valmy on the 20th of September 1792. Bernadotte was with the Army of the Rhine as it subsequently surged forwards to occupy cities on the western bank of the River Rhine. The French victory at Valmy gave the National Assembly confidence to depose Louis XVI and establish a French Republic. On the 21st of January 1793, Louis was executed at the guillotine, but while the more radical revolutionaries may have got their way, the military situation was rapidly turning against the French Republic as Brunswick reoccupied the western bank of the Rhine. Next, Maximilien Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety presided over a reign of terror in France, accusing political and military leaders of cowardice and treachery, and General Custine was executed in August, while General Dumouriez defected to the Austrians. In the meantime, Bernadotte was earning a reputation for bravery and gaining in popularity amongst his men on the front in Western Germany, just as the old officer corps was being replaced by new up-and-coming commanders who did not have ties to the old aristocratic regime. During the summer, he was elected captain and then lieutenant colonel in quick succession. Meanwhile, the 36th joined General Jean-Baptiste Jourdan's Army of the North, which was facing an Austrian army under Count Josias of Coburg, but remained in reserve when Jourdan won a victory at Wattignies in October. The architect of the renewed French successes was War Minister Lazare Carnot, who reformed the French army to create demi-brigades by combining established line regiments with new volunteer regiments. In April 1794, Bernadotte became colonel of the 71st Demi-Brigade. The unit was soon involved in clashes in the Netherlands, where the French were trying to conquer the Austrian territories and the Dutch Republic. In an inauspicious start, the 71st Demi-Brigade fled upon its first encounter with the enemy, but Bernadotte rallied them by theatrically tearing off his epaulettes and threatening to resign his command. The 71st rallied and defeated the Austrian attack. Bernadotte earned a reputation as an inspirational leader as a result of his actions and gained the praise of his immediate superior, General Jean-Baptiste Kleber. When Bernadotte continued to distinguish himself in the weeks that followed, Kleber promoted him to the rank of brigadier general. Thus, at 31 years of age, Bernadotte was a general, albeit a junior one. Further victories in the months that followed enabled the French to conquer the Austrian Netherlands, and, by October, divisions were advancing into the Rhineland in western Germany again. Here, Bernadotte distinguished himself by turning the Austrian flank while crossing the Ruhr Valley. With winter approaching, Bernadotte turned north with his men and joined Kleber in the siege of Maastricht in the Dutch Republic. As 1795 began, fighting around the Rhine continued back and forth. During this campaign, Bernadotte became the first general in history to make an aerial reconnaissance in a balloon, but stormy weather prevented him from seeing much. The following month, the French were retreating over the Rhine when the pontoon bridges at Neuwied were accidentally set on fire, forcing Bernadotte to fight a rearguard action to hold the Austrians back while the bridge was repaired. By the end of the spring, and thanks to the military successes of Bernadotte and his senior commanders, the Netherlands were firmly under the control of the French, and the Dutch Republic was transformed into a new Batavian Republic as a revolutionary sister republic of France. Bernadotte's rise would soon be tied to Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican general who had earned himself a reputation for commanding the artillery at the siege of Toulon against the British in the winter of 1793, and who had been appointed in the spring of 1796 to lead the army of Italy against the Austrians in the plain of Lombardy. Heavily outnumbered, Bonaparte had taken great risks and was vulnerable to an Austrian counterattack. In this light, the French government decided to send Bonaparte an army of 20,000 men as reinforcements. They appointed Bernadotte to lead these men to Italy. Bernadotte arrived at Milan by late February 1797 and met Napoleon for the first time at his headquarters outside Mantua on the 3rd of March. The army of Italy was opposed by Archduke Charles of Austria, the most talented of the Austrian commanders. Since Charles's 50,000 men were widely dispersed in northeastern Italy, Bonaparte took advantage by taking the offensive before the Austrians could gather their forces. As commander of the 4th Division on Bonaparte's right, Bernadotte distinguished himself at the crossing of the Tagliamento River on the 16th of March. But a costly frontal assault against the fortress at Gradisca a week later earned him a rebuke from Napoleon. For the remainder of the campaign, Bernadotte advanced through what is now Slovenia until a preliminary peace was agreed between Napoleon and the Austrians at Leoben on the 18th of April 1797. Bonaparte now secured recognition for French sister republics in northern Italy. Bernadotte was appointed governor of the Friuli region in northeastern Italy as part of these arrangements. In August, Bernadotte headed for Paris. Although he took a warm letter of recommendation from Bonaparte and was received with great honour in the capital, when Bonaparte's political patron, Paul Barras, offered him a command in southern France, Bernadotte refused it and decided instead to return to Italy, where Napoleon was negotiating the final peace treaty with the Austrians at Campo Formio. Under the terms of the treaty that was signed here on the 17th of October 1797, Napoleon exchanged Venice and the Veneto region for Austrian recognition of the independence of Napoleon's Cisalpine Republic in northern Italy. Thereafter, as Napoleon headed back to Paris to begin planning an invasion of England or Ireland, Bernadotte was surprised to be appointed by the French Foreign Minister Charles Maurice de Talleyrand as French ambassador to Austria. While he initially made a good enough impression in Vienna, Bernadotte soon made the ill-judged decision to fly the French tricolour at the embassy. Foreign embassies in Austria did not fly flags, and Bernadotte's display of French republicanism in the centre of Vienna, the capital of a country which had just been defeated by France in a war, provoked a riot. Bernadotte saw the rioting as an insult to the Republic and chose to leave his diplomatic post and return to France. While Talleyrand and Bonaparte were appalled by Bernadotte's undiplomatic behaviour, he was celebrated in Paris for upholding the honour of the Republic. Following this short-lived diplomatic posting, Bernadotte requested leave from the army and took up residence in the town of Sceaux, near Paris. During one of his frequent visits to the city, he was reacquainted with the Clary family of Marseille. During the intervening period, François Clary had died, and his daughter, Julie, had married Napoleon's elder brother, Joseph. Napoleon had intended to marry Désirée Clary, but soon broke the betrothal to marry Josephine de Beauharnais on the eve of his departure for Italy in 1796. Although the seeds of his rivalry with Napoleon were already sprouting, Bernadotte was on good terms with Napoleon's brothers Joseph and Lucien, and it was at Joseph's mansion where he met Désirée, now 20 years old and still single. Désirée was attracted to Bernadotte and later claimed she married him because he was the only person who could stand up to Napoleon. After a brief courtship, the pair were married in a civil ceremony in August 1798, witnessed by Joseph and Lucien. The newlywed couple initially lived at Bernadotte's house in Sceaux, but soon moved into more luxurious premises in Paris. In the meantime, Napoleon had led an amphibious campaign across the Mediterranean to invade Egypt, the ultimate goal being a fanciful plan to march overland through Central Asia and invade British India. In Napoleon's absence, Bernadotte was offered command of the Army of Italy early in 1799 as war was erupting again with Austria. He declined, observing that with Britain seeking to forge a new coalition including Austria, Russia, Naples and the Ottoman Empire, he would be ill-equipped to deal with an Austrian counterattack in northern Italy. Instead, Bernadotte accepted command of an army of observation on the Rhine. over the course of the year that followed, his fears that the army of Italy was not well enough provided for were realized as the Austrians overran parts of the plain of Lombardy. As Austrian troops and their allies advanced in Germany, Bernadotte lacked the manpower to make much difference. Then illness soon forced him to return to Paris. In response to military disasters on every front, the leaders of the French government considered how best to respond. Since 1795, France had been governed by a 5-man executive committee named the Directory, whose power was further diluted by 2 legislative bodies, the Council of the Ancients and the Council of the 500. Among the politicians seeking reform were the constitutional theorist Emmanuel-Joseph Sieyès, recently named to the Directory, Paul Barras and Talleyrand, who had recently been dismissed as foreign minister. While all 3 had their own particular interests, they were united in the desire to strengthen the executive and weaken the legislature. In June 1799, Sieyès offered Bernadotte command of the Paris garrison with the understanding that he would support the overthrow of the current system. Bernadotte hesitated, and the young General Barthélemy Joubert was appointed instead, while Bernadotte was appointed war minister. He took measures to strengthen morale and discipline throughout the army and ordered Joubert to take command of the army of Italy. However, Bernadotte was soon removed from office after just 10 weeks when his appeal to the spirit of 1792, when the Republic first went to war, led the centrist Sieyès to consider him too much of a Jacobin and a radical. In early October 1799, Paris was astonished to hear that General Bonaparte, whose forces had ended up trapped in Egypt after their fleet was destroyed by the British in the Nile Delta the previous summer, had landed at the small port of Fréjus with a small cohort of followers after leaving Egypt and slipping through the British naval blockade. Bonaparte's arrival was greeted with jubilation among the French. An astonished Bernadotte argued that Napoleon should be court-martialed for 2 counts. Firstly, for leaving 30,000 men behind in Egypt under General Kléber, and secondly, for violating quarantine restrictions in place as a result of the spread of plague among Napoleon's Army of the Orient. While Sieyès approached Bonaparte to lead his intended coup, Bernadotte continued to withhold his support despite being a member of the extended Bonaparte family through his marriage. On the morning of the 9th of November 1799, or 18 Brumaire by the French Republican calendar, Bernadotte was in civilian dress when he called on Napoleon and found him with a group of senior officers in uniform. Bernadotte steadfastly refused Napoleon's request to join the coup that they were about to initiate, but informed him that he would not do anything to stop him unless explicitly ordered to do so by the legislature. The plotters initiated the coup by claiming that there was a Jacobin conspiracy against the 2 legislative councils and moved them to the Château of Saint-Cloud, conveniently isolated in former royal parkland to the west of Paris. The situation remained confused by the end of the day, and overnight Bernadotte consulted with General Jourdan and Augereau, who had also refused to support Napoleon. While Bernadotte proposed going to Saint-Cloud to present himself as co-protector of the Republic alongside Bonaparte, he remained in Paris for the day. At Saint-Cloud, Napoleon ran out of patience as his supporters struggled to promote his cause, but his own attempt was also to no avail. Napoleon then stormed into the Council of 500, where his brother Lucien was president. There, violence broke out. After Napoleon retreated to safety, Lucien ordered the troops to clear the chamber, but not before dramatically pointing his sword at his brother and vowing to run him through if he ever betrayed the principles of the Republic and the Revolution. With this, Napoleon and his allies successfully seized power. Following the coup, Bernadotte prepared to flee from Paris, fearful that Napoleon would now seek revenge for his not having supported him unequivocally, but returned home after Joseph assured him that he was in no danger. In the aftermath of the coup of 18 Brumaire, the French government was reorganized to be headed by a consulate of 3 men. Napoleon became first consul and the de facto ruler of France. As Bonaparte was determined to unite rather than punish rival political factions, he appointed Bernadotte to the Council of State. Bernadotte was soon appointed to command the Army of the West, charged with suppressing the long-running revolt in the Vendée region of Brittany. Napoleon himself crossed the Alps into Italy to narrowly defeat the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo on the 14th of June 1800. After peace was agreed with Austria at Lunéville in February 1801, Bernadotte hoped to play a leading role in a future invasion of England, but the first consul was more interested in making peace overtures to Britain, and after protracted negotiations between Joseph Bonaparte and Lord Charles Cornwallis, the Treaty of Amiens was agreed in March 1802, bringing peace to Europe for the first time in 10 years. Bernadotte was now at a loose end for the first time in many years. Back in late 1801, Napoleon had decided to send an expedition to Haiti to overthrow the government led by the former slave Toussaint Louverture. When Napoleon appointed his brother-in-law, Charles Victor Leclerc, to head the campaign, Bernadotte was disappointed to have been overlooked. This proved a stroke of luck, as a yellow fever epidemic would devastate the French army, claiming Leclerc's life in November 1802. As Napoleon consolidated his power in the early 1800s and began to establish a dictatorship behind the facade of republicanism, Bernadotte started attracting a group of Napoleon's critics, and while he himself had no inclination to lead a coup and try to overthrow Napoleon, he came under surveillance from Napoleon's agents. Bernadotte was particularly incensed to discover that General Louis-Nicolas Davout, who held a command in Napoleon's consular guard, had appointed an agent to keep track of his actions. In his efforts to find a prestigious appointment for the troublesome Bernadotte that would keep him at a distance, Napoleon proposed that Bernadotte should become governor of Louisiana, the vast territory in North America west of the Mississippi that had been recently returned to France from Spain. Bernadotte was additionally appointed minister to the United States, but as he prepared to set sail, he learned that Napoleon was also negotiating the sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States. In the meantime, the Treaty of Amiens had collapsed in May 1803, and Britain and France were once again at war. Given these developments, Bernadotte resigned his diplomatic position and offered to serve Napoleon in a military capacity. The offer was not immediately accepted, as Napoleon had plenty of generals. In the meantime, Napoleon was facing a British-backed royalist conspiracy to overthrow him. While Bernadotte avoided being implicated, General Moreau was implicated in the plot and sent into exile in the United States. In Napoleon's mind, this left Bernadotte as his most dangerous rival among his generals, but by the beginning of May 1804, Désirée brokered a reconciliation between the two that led to Bernadotte's appointment as governor of Hanover in northwestern Germany, which had recently been occupied by French troops at the expense of its sovereign, King George III of Great Britain. In May 1804, Napoleon removed the final vestiges of republican government and declared his intention to be proclaimed as Emperor of the French. In tandem, Napoleon revived the long-dormant title of Marshal of France and granted it to 18 of his most senior generals. Bernadotte was amongst them, a clear sign that after years of an uneasy rivalry between them, Napoleon had decided to accept Bernadotte into the fold as a trusted general of France. After a ceremony at Saint-Cloud, where he was awarded the title of Marshal, Bernadotte left for Hanover and arrived in the middle of June. He performed his duties well in Germany and avoided a heavy-handed approach in his treatment of these new French subjects. By the 2nd of December 1804, he was back in Paris for Napoleon's coronation ceremony at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Then, in early 1805, the Bernadottes were given Moreau's confiscated mansion at Rue d'Anjou in Paris, which became their main residence. While Bernadotte returned to Hanover, Napoleon was preparing to launch his army of 150,000 men, encamped at Boulogne, against England, provided the French navy could break the British blockade and escort the invasion force across the English Channel, a task that proved impossible. Meanwhile, the British Prime Minister, William Pitt, had organised a coalition bringing together Austria, Russia and Naples against Napoleon. On the 28th of August 1805, with General Karl Mack's Austrians marching through Bavaria, Napoleon abandoned his plans for the invasion of England and turned his army eastwards. As part of Napoleon's new plan, Bernadotte's 15,000-strong corps in Hanover was designated One Corps of la Grande Armée, the new name for the reorganized French army that Napoleon had constituted. With Napoleon's main forces marching from the west, Bernadotte was to march on Ulm in southern Germany, where the Austrian commander, Mack, had halted to await reinforcements from his Russian ally, General Mikhail Kutuzov. Napoleon planned to catch Mack unaware by his speed of march, and Bernadotte was ordered to take a shortcut via Ansbach. This land belonged to neutral Prussia, prompting a diplomatic protest from Berlin, but no hostilities. After entering Munich in mid-October, Bernadotte attached Bavarian units to his corps. An astonished Mack discovered that Napoleon was in the process of surrounding Ulm and, after a few half-hearted attempts to break out, 50,000 Austrian troops surrendered on the 20th of October. After learning of Mack's fate, Kutuzov retreated down the Danube to await further Russian reinforcements. The Ulm campaign was one of the greatest French victories during the Napoleonic Wars, and Bernadotte played a major role in it. By the end of October, Bernadotte had reached Salzburg and then crossed the Danube into Bohemia in modern-day Czechia. Meanwhile, Napoleon marched on and entered Vienna, the Austrians abandoning their capital to the French. In the weeks that followed, the Russians and Austrians gathered their forces and were preparing for a counterattack. Napoleon was desperate to bring his enemy to battle and did everything he could to convince the Austrians and Russians that his army was in a poor condition. Part of this deception involved keeping an understrength army at Brunn and relying on Bernadotte's and Davout's corps to march to his aid in time for the battle. Over little more than 24 hours between the 29th and 30th of November, Bernadotte marched over 50 miles to join Napoleon's camp to the southeast of Brunn, looking out towards a place called Austerlitz. The battle began early on the 2nd. As Napoleon had anticipated, the enemy launched a massive attack on his right flank. A brilliant defensive general, Davout, held on stubbornly, while Napoleon ordered Marshal Soult's corps, hitherto concealed by the morning mist, to attack the weakened Austrian and Russian centre on the Pratzen Heights. The Russian Imperial Guard launched a desperate counterattack against Soult that threatened to shift the momentum of the battle, but Bernadotte and Napoleon's Guard cavalry counterattacked and destroyed the cream of the Russian army. By early afternoon, the Battle of Austerlitz was effectively over. Bernadotte played a key part in Napoleon's famous victory at Austerlitz, which led Emperor Francis of Austria to agree to an immediate armistice. With the Austrians out of the war yet again, Napoleon turned his attention to the powerful kingdom of Prussia in northern Germany. Napoleon hoped to make Prussia an ally in his clash with the Russians and offered Hanover to King Frederick William III. As part of these arrangements, Bernadotte was named as governor of Ansbach, a Prussian territory which was given to France in exchange for Hanover being granted to Prussia. Napoleon further honoured Bernadotte with the title Prince of Pontecorvo, referring to a former papal possession that had been incorporated into the new Kingdom of Naples under Joseph Bonaparte. During the summer of 1806, however, after Napoleon organised the West German states into a French protectorate known as the Confederation of the Rhine, Prussia decided to renege on these arrangements and switched sides to ally with Britain and Russia against France. Bernadotte once again took command of one corps, which would serve as the vanguard alongside Marshal Murat, Napoleon's cavalry commander and brother-in-law, with Davout's three corps close behind, as La Grande Armée advanced into northern Germany. In the ensuing campaign, the main Prussian army of 65,000 men was commanded by the Duke of Brunswick, while a second army of 45,000 was under Prince von Hohenlohe. The Prussian generals struggled to cooperate with each other, and the erratic movements of the Prussian armies confused Napoleon. On the 13th of October, he believed that the Prussians were planning to fight a battle near the university town of Jena. As Napoleon sought to encircle the Prussians here, Bernadotte and Davout now found themselves on the right flank. The following day, Napoleon fought and defeated a Prussian army at Jena, but unbeknownst to him, Davout encountered and defeated Brunswick's much larger force at Auerstedt, some 8 miles to the northeast. The previous night, Bernadotte had received ambiguous orders which allowed him to either march with Davout or to follow his original orders to march on Jena via the town of Dornburg. Bernadotte chose the latter, and by the time Davout requested support, he was too far away to provide assistance. Difficult terrain meant that by the time Bernadotte reached Jena, Napoleon had already defeated Hohenlohe. Bernadotte's absence from the battles of Jena and Auerstedt was one of the most controversial aspects of his career, although his pride prevented him from admitting that he may have misunderstood the spirit of Napoleon's orders. Bernadotte's fresh corps was in prime position to pursue the routed and fleeing Prussians. On the 17th, he stormed the fortress at Halle and defeated a strong Prussian reserve army. For the remainder of the month, Bernadotte was pursuing General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher's 20,000 Prussians across northern Germany. On the 5th of November, Blücher took refuge in the port city of Lübeck on the Baltic coast. The following day, Bernadotte stormed the city, and Blücher capitulated soon after. Among the prisoners at Lübeck were 1,500 Swedish troops being redeployed to protect Swedish Pomerania in the southern Baltic from potential French attack, the Swedes having entered the wars against France some time beforehand, but now suddenly finding themselves on the front lines against the French for the first time. Bernadotte treated the Swedes well and impressed the Swedish general Gustav Mörner with his understanding of Scandinavian affairs. While he could not have known it at the time, these encounters with the Swedes would have profound implications for his future. Despite the destruction of two Prussian armies at Jena and Austerlitz, the campaign continued through the winter as Tsar Alexander I of Russia mobilized his forces to come to Prussia's aid. Napoleon's men had to spread out across a large area to keep themselves supplied, enabling Russian General Bennigsen to harass isolated French corps. In late January 1807, a Russian force attacked Bernadotte at Morungen, in what is now northern Poland, and captured his baggage train, but Bernadotte managed to withdraw in good order. The action at Morungen inspired Napoleon to use Bernadotte as bait to lure Bennigsen into a trap. However, not having received any orders from Napoleon and a communications breakdown ensuing, Bernadotte missed out on the bloody but inconclusive Battle of Eylau, fought on the 7th and 8th of February 1807. Both the French and Russian armies spent the next few months restoring their strength until fighting restarted in early June. After Bernadotte was wounded in the neck at the Battle of Spanden in early June, command of his divisions was transferred to General Claude Victor, who led a key attack at the Battle of Friedland 2 weeks later, which decisively defeated Bennigsen's army and won Victor a marshal's baton. Bernadotte recovered quickly and was able to attend the celebrations that accompanied the Peace of Tilsit, agreed between Napoleon and Alexander in early July. Through this, Russia and France allied with each other, while Prussia was stripped of huge amounts of territory and reduced to the status of a second-rate power as Napoleon formed a new Duchy of Warsaw out of much of its Polish territory. Bernadotte spent the next year and a half acting as governor of the Hanseatic towns of Hamburg, Bremen and Lübeck. Although France was still at war with Britain and was facing a growing insurrection across the Iberian Peninsula, this was otherwise an unusual period of peace on the continent during Napoleon's reign, and Bernadotte spent much of it trying to enforce the continental system in these important German ports. The continental system was Napoleon's attempt to cripple Britain's ability to wage war by blockading continental European ports to British trade. Bernadotte kept himself well informed of matters in Sweden, which was one of the few European states not to have signed up to the continental system. At Tilsit, Napoleon promised to support a Russian invasion of Sweden to bring it into the continental system. When Russia invaded in February 1808, Bernadotte seemed ready to lead an army against Sweden, but it was in Napoleon's interests to keep Alexander distracted from affairs elsewhere in Europe, particularly Poland. By 1809, Russia had defeated Sweden single-handedly and annexed Finland. Austria decided to renew hostilities in early 1809. In response, Napoleon had to quickly organize an army in Germany to face the Austrians. Bernadotte was ordered to lead a French division into Saxony and form a new corps with the Saxon army. With many of the veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Friedland now serving in Spain, Napoleon's new army of Germany initially struggled against Archduke Charles of Austria. Although Napoleon seized the initiative by the end of April and occupied Vienna in May, his first attempt to cross the Danube to the northeast of Vienna was defeated in mid-May. After spending 6 weeks fortifying his position, Napoleon attempted a second crossing on the same ground in early July. On the 5th of July, Bernadotte occupied the village of Audeclar in the French centre, opposite Archduke Charles's headquarters at Wagram, but Napoleon's attempts to break through the Austrian lines were unsuccessful. The following morning, Bernadotte recognized that his divisions were in a vulnerable position and ordered his men to fall back from Audeclar without informing Napoleon. The emperor was incensed and ordered Bernadotte to reoccupy the village, but the Saxons were soon driven back again by an Austrian counterattack. As Bernadotte desperately tried to rally his men, Napoleon launched a heavy cavalry charge to win him time to reorganize his line. The French eventually pushed forward against both enemy flanks, and Bernadotte's Saxons rallied to support the advance in the centre. While Napoleon negotiated the latest humiliating peace with the Austrians, Bernadotte was sent back to Paris. At the end of July, the capital received alarming news that a British army had landed on the island of Walcheren in the Netherlands. After an appeal from Napoleon's brother, King Louis of Holland, Bernadotte was appointed to command National Guard units hastily levied to defend the invasion. In the event, the 40,000-strong British force under Lord Chatham did not move and spent several months languishing on the disease-ridden island before evacuating in December 1809. Napoleon did not appreciate Bernadotte's boasting of his successes and summoned him back to Vienna, where Bernadotte reassured the emperor of his support. While Napoleon offered Bernadotte various appointments in Italy, the Marshal chose to take sick leave at his country estate of Lagrange near Paris. In the summer of 1810, Bernadotte learned that a party of pro-French noblemen in Sweden was proposing for him to be designated as heir to the Swedish throne. In March 1809, King Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden had been deposed in a coup as the Swedish nobility responded furiously to the cataclysmic defeat by Russia in the war. He was replaced by his elderly uncle, who became King Charles XIII. As the new 61-year-old king was childless, a Danish prince was initially adopted as crown prince, but his death at the end of May 1810 threw the succession open again. Since Napoleon was the de facto master of Europe, a group of Swedish nobles were in favour of a French candidate, preferably a Marshal and a relation of the Bonaparte family, and Bernadotte fitted the bill on both counts. While Napoleon was surprised to hear that Bernadotte had been approached, he gave him his support. It was hoped by both the French and Swedish to contain Russian ambitions in Scandinavia by bringing Sweden more firmly into the French sphere of influence. Thus, in August 1810, Charles XIII convened an assembly at Örebro to decide on the succession, and Bernadotte was unanimously elected as his heir. At the age of 47, after a career in French uniform, Bernadotte left France and arrived at Stockholm in late October, where he adopted the more Norse name Carl Johan, or Charles John. He was soon joined by his wife Désirée and their 11-year-old son Oscar, though the cold Nordic climate led Désirée to return to Paris the following summer. Bernadotte made a good impression at the Swedish court, though he failed to learn Swedish and had to rely on French-speaking advisors. With the king in increasingly poor health, the Crown Prince took the initiative in political affairs. Although he had come to Sweden with Napoleon's blessing and formally declared war on Britain, the lucrative trade with Britain continued in secret in violation of the continental system. While his supporters might have wanted him to attack Russia to regain Finland, Carl Johan believed instead that Sweden's future lay in a Scandinavian union with Norway, then ruled by Napoleon's Danish ally. Bernadotte took care to maintain good relations with Napoleon, but behind the scenes he was drifting closer to Tsar Alexander I of Russia. Although officially allies since 1807, tensions over the future of Poland and the continental system caused relations between Tsar Alexander and Napoleon to break down, leading Bonaparte to invade Russia in 1812. In order to secure his northern flank in advance of the drive into Russia, Napoleon ordered Davout to occupy Swedish Pomerania in northern Germany. This provocation caused Bernadotte to increase his diplomatic engagement with Russia and Britain, and in April he was promised 15,000 Russian troops to support a Swedish invasion of Norway in return for Swedish support should France invade Russia. In late June, Napoleon crossed the river Niemen and launched his invasion of Russia. The following month, Sweden signed formal peace treaties with Russia and Britain, though for the time being remained neutral in the Franco-Russian War. Tsar Alexander then proposed to meet Bernadotte at the Finnish city of Åbo, where, in late August 1812, the two men signed a treaty. Here, Alexander committed to sending 35,000 men to support Bernadotte's Norwegian enterprise, though the latter understood that Russia could spare no troops for the time being. It was all an indication that while he might be a Frenchman, Bernadotte was now clearly looking out for his own interests in Sweden. When Napoleon reached Moscow in mid-September 1812, Bernadotte urged Alexander to fight on. A month later, with his armies starved of provisions, La Grande Armée was compelled to withdraw from Moscow and embarked on an infamous retreat. While Prussia joined Russia in liberating northern Germany from Napoleonic rule, by the spring of 1813, Napoleon had rebuilt an army of over 220,000 men, which he led into Saxony. In the meantime, Bernadotte reoccupied Swedish Pomerania, but he was still reluctant to answer British and Russian calls to more openly support the coalition forces against France in Germany. Soon after, Bernadotte left Stockholm at the head of 30,000 Swedish troops and proceeded across the Baltic Sea to Germany. Bernadotte was informed by the Tsar's envoy, the Corsican émigré Count Carl Pozzo di Borgo, that the Allied generals and commanders wished to consult with him on strategic matters, and in July he arrived at Allied headquarters at the castle of Trachtenberg in Silesia, now southwestern Poland. Applying his experience as a French marshal, Bernadotte proposed dividing the coalition forces into three main armies. An army of Bohemia, with 220,000 Austrians, an army of Silesia of 95,000 Prussians and Russians, commanded by the Prussian general Blücher, and an army of the north of 120,000 Swedes, Prussians and Russians, commanded by Bernadotte himself. The three armies would engage Napoleon's marshals and defeat them separately, while avoiding battle with Napoleon himself until the coalition forces had an overwhelming numerical advantage. Bernadotte proposed himself as supreme commander, but Austrian General Karl von Schwarzenberg was appointed instead. Hostilities resumed in mid-August, and although Schwarzenberg had been defeated by Napoleon at Dresden in late August 1813, Blücher defeated Marshal MacDonald at the Katzbach on the same day, while Bernadotte's Army of the North successfully defended Berlin from French Marshals Oudinot and Ney. On both occasions, the Prussians did most of the fighting, and Bernadotte was criticized for his excessive caution and his failure to pursue the enemy. In the meantime, the army of Bohemia had recovered from its defeat at Dresden by defeating General Van Damme's isolated corps at Kulm. While the three allied sovereigns at Schwarzenberg's headquarters were planning to march back into Saxony, Bernadotte was seemingly in no hurry to do battle with his former colleagues. The allied monarchs of Russia, Prussia, and Austria encouraged him to advance, and he marched south at the beginning of October. Nevertheless, he continued to be concerned about his rear, and it was only the unanimous opposition of his subordinates that prevented him from turning back. By mid-October, Schwarzenberg's men were approaching Leipzig from the south, while Blücher began taking positions to the north. The following day, the Battle of Leipzig began, as Napoleon launched an attack on Schwarzenberg. Having failed to make the intended breakthrough, Napoleon assumed the defensive as more enemy troops arrived on the field, though it was not until the 18th of October that Bernadotte arrived. Appearing conspicuously in his full dress uniform, Bernadotte's striking presence on the battlefield was further enhanced by the presence of the experimental British Rocket Brigade that had only recently been formed and which were attached to the Swedish Crown Prince's command. Their erratic projectiles struck fear into the French ranks. Bernadotte's arrival also prompted the defection of several Saxon units, many of which had served under his command in 1809. Leipzig ultimately ended in a stalemate of sorts, but Napoleon was severely outnumbered by the late autumn of 1813 and was now fighting a defensive withdrawal westwards. While Schwarzenberg and Blücher's armies continued west towards France, Bernadotte marched north. While part of his rationale was to put pressure on Marshal Davout's garrison at Hamburg, his real objective was to force Denmark to give up Norway. When Tsar Alexander proposed a coordinated invasion of France, Bernadotte detached a Russian and Prussian corps to support an uprising against Napoleonic rule in the Netherlands, but led his remaining Swedes in an invasion of Denmark that met with little resistance. On the 14th of January 1814, the Treaty of Kiel was signed, through which Sweden acquired Norway from Denmark in exchange for Swedish Pomerania. Bernadotte was now able to turn his attention to France, motivated by faint hopes of becoming King of France. In early February, he reached the Rhineland, where he had won his first major military victories 2 decades earlier. As he moved towards Paris, Bernadotte's proclamations that he had come as a liberator rather than a conqueror proved ineffective. In any case, Blucher was within striking distance of Paris, and despite a brilliant defensive campaign by Napoleon against overwhelming numbers, the coalition forces occupied Paris at the very end of March 1814, with Bernadotte still far behind. In Bernadotte's absence, Tsar Alexander and the former French Foreign Minister Talleyrand had agreed between them to restore the royal house of Bourbon to the French throne under King Louis XVIII, the younger brother of the executed Louis XVI. When Bernadotte finally arrived at Paris in April, he spent 3 weeks in the French capital, meeting former colleagues and seeking international recognition for the Treaty of Kiel. In May, by which time Bernadotte was on his way back to Sweden, a Norwegian assembly adopted a liberal constitution and elected Danish Prince Christian Frederick as their king. After Bernadotte returned to Stockholm in June, his attempts to negotiate with Christian Frederick were to no avail, and he reluctantly began an invasion of Norway in late July. The Swedish-Norwegian War that followed was very short and resulted in Swedish gains, such that by mid-August a convention was agreed whereby Norway would be united to Sweden while maintaining its own constitution. The new Scandinavian Union was subsequently recognized at the Congress of Vienna, the gathering of European leaders and diplomats to determine the borders of post-Napoleonic Europe. There, Bernadotte argued that the Danes had lost their right to Swedish Pomerania by supporting Christian Frederick's cause, and the territory was instead transferred to Prussia. It was as the Congress of Vienna was concluding its work that Europe was astonished to hear, in March 1815, of Napoleon's escape from his enforced exile on the island of Elba off the coast of Tuscany. Bernadotte was impressed when Napoleon entered Paris on the 20th of March and began restoring his empire. On this occasion, having secured Norway already, Bernadotte made no attempt to support the coalition intervention against Napoleon, which led to the latter's final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo in the summer of 1815, exile to St. Helena, and the end of the Napoleonic Wars. On the 5th of February 1818, King Charles XIII of Sweden died, and the 55-year-old Bernadotte succeeded him as King Carl XIV Johan of Sweden. While he hoped that his wife Désirée would join him in Stockholm for the coronation, her doctors had previously advised her to remain in France for health reasons, and he did not press her further. Thus, he was crowned King of Sweden on the 11th of May without the presence of his consort. The new king sought to strengthen his family's position on the throne by marrying his son Oscar to a royal princess. In 1821, he settled on Josephine, the teenage daughter of his former colleague and Napoleon's stepson, Eugène de Beauharnais. After losing his position as Viceroy of Italy, Eugène lived in Bavaria with his wife Augusta, the daughter of the King of Bavaria. The 22-year-old Oscar was not prepared to follow through without meeting his prospective bride, and received his father's blessing to meet Josephine and other prospective brides from across Europe. Oscar travelled to Bavaria and was betrothed to Josephine in due course. In the spring of 1823, as the 16-year-old Josephine made her way to Stockholm, she was joined by Désirée, who was delighted by her daughter-in-law. As King of Sweden, Carl Johan conducted state affairs in a somewhat informal manner and continued to rely on French-speaking subjects as well as the Swedish-speaking Oscar. In the 1820s, he built the small Rosendal Palace in the park of Djurgården, which became his favoured retreat and now serves as a museum honouring the first king of the Bernadotte dynasty. Karl Johan supported the commercial development of his kingdom by approving the construction of the Gotha Canal, linking the city of Gothenburg to the Baltic Sea, as well as a road-building project that linked the Norwegian city of Trondheim to Stockholm. While he was generally popular among both his Swedish and Norwegian subjects, when a revolution in France brought King Louis-Philippe I to the throne in July 1830 at the head of a liberal monarchy, Karl Johan faced increasing attacks from the radical and liberal press in Sweden. He was particularly concerned by the satirical attacks in the Aftonbladet, or evening paper published by Lars Johan Hierta. Karl Johan sought to stifle Hierta's calls for greater civil liberties and political rights through censorship, compelling Hierta to establish new papers every few months to get around the bans. By 1840, Hierta was publishing what he called the 21st evening paper. To get away from the political attacks which damaged his health, Karl Johan spent more of his time in Oslo, the capital of Norway, where his palace still stands at one end of Karl Johan's Gate, the city's main thoroughfare. Although he had been a soldier for so much of his adult life, Karl Johan was worried that Sweden would get caught up in the rivalry which was developing between Britain and Russia in the years following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and declared Swedish neutrality as a national point of principle, setting a direction for Swedish foreign policy that would be maintained until the 2020s. In July 1838, soon after receiving Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, Karl Johan suffered a fall from his horse, which damaged his health considerably. In January 1840, by now entering his late 70s, he survived an attempt by the Parliament to force him to abdicate by giving more power to his ministers and promising further concessions. The opposition backed down, recognizing that Oscar would soon succeed his aging father in any event. They had to wait several more years. Karl Johan celebrated his silver jubilee in February 1843, and then his 81st birthday in January 1844, but he suffered a stroke the morning of the latter celebration and died several weeks later on the 8th of March 1844. He was buried in the newly designated Bernadotte Chapel at Riddarholmen Church in Stockholm, the traditional resting place of Sweden's kings since the mid-17th century. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte lived one of the most extraordinary lives of the Napoleonic era. The son of a lawyer in southern France, he exploited the opportunities presented by the French Revolution to become one of the most popular generals of the French Revolutionary Wars. His relationship with Napoleon was extremely complicated, and while he played a leading role in many of Napoleon's military campaigns, his position as a potential rival to Bonaparte during the late 1790s had ensured that the relationship between them was always strained, despite Napoleon's respect for Bernadotte's abilities as a military commander, something which led him to make Bernadotte one of the new marshals of the French Empire in 1804. This uneasy relationship ended with Bernadotte turning against Napoleon after he became the heir designate to the throne of Sweden and siding with Russia and Britain after Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. There were many similarities between Bernadotte and Bonaparte, both being ambitious and independent-minded individuals who could inspire men to great deeds. While Bernadotte's abilities as a commander might have fallen short of Napoleon's, his skillful diplomacy enabled him not only to expand his realm by acquiring control of Norway before he ever became King of Sweden, but to build a dynasty that outlived the Bonapartes in France and continues to reign in Stockholm down to the present day. What do you think of Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte? Was he a traitor to the Napoleonic cause, or were his actions justified given Napoleon's increasingly poor decisions in the early 1810s? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.